What if I told you that the most famous horror writer in the world hides secrets darker than his own books? That the man who made millions tremble with It and The Shining once admitted, "I was never supposed to be born." Behind the bat-covered gates of his mansion in Maine lies a life filled with whispers too strange to dismiss. A father who vanished without a trace. A boyhood obsession with murders so grotesque his own mother nearly sent him to a psychiatrist. A psychological test that branded him unstable. And townsfolk who swear they've seen him walking into the woods at midnight to speak with creatures whose eyes glowed in the dark. Some call him a genius, others call him a fraud, even the devil's voice on earth. He's been blamed for real-life tragedies, received letters filled with venom and threats, and once opened his door to a man holding what he swore was a bomb. And yet, there's another side. A husband whose wife once walked out without a word. A father terrified of losing his children. A man haunted by the thought of his own imagination turning against him. Stay with me until the end, because only then will you see the part of Stephen King that even his books cannot explain. The moment where reality and nightmare become one. In the quiet heart of Maine lies Bangor, a town surrounded by ancient forests and winding roads that seem to whisper their own stories. On one of its streets rises a towering Victorian mansion with sharp, wrought iron gates. Twisting among the metal bars are dark shapes of bats, frozen mid-flight, their wings spread as if guarding the secrets inside. It's a place that locals pass carefully, lowering their voices as though the house itself is listening. This is the home of Stephen King, a name that echoes far beyond Bangor, across America, across oceans, into nearly every country on Earth. For decades, his stories have unsettled, disturbed, and fascinated millions of readers. He has written more than most could imagine. Novels that climb instantly to bestseller lists, short stories that grow into films, screenplays that crawl onto television screens. His books alone, stacked together, could fill a library. And yet each carries that same mark, that same unmistakable chill that makes people whisper his name with both admiration and unease. Stephen King has lived much of his life under a strange double light, adored by readers, feared by critics, treated as a local myth by his own town. His success is staggering, his influence undeniable, but his true self remains hidden, like the locked rooms he so often writes about. To understand him, one must step past the bats on the gate, past the grand Victorian facade, and into the shadows where reality begins to blur with imagination. It is there, inside that house in Bangor, that the story of Stephen King truly begins. Stephen King likes to insist that his childhood was ordinary, nothing special, nothing worth pointing out. But the shadows of his early years tell a different story. When Stephen was just 2 years old, his father stepped out of the house one evening, telling his wife he was going to buy cigarettes. He never returned. The door closed behind him, and for Stephen and his older brother David, it never opened again. The two boys were left with their mother, Ruth, who suddenly found herself alone, carrying the weight of raising them without answers. Stephen's brother, too young to accept silence, once whispered to him, "Dad was taken by something not from here." For the little boy, that thought, strange, fantastic, and terrifying, never really disappeared. Growing up in small New England towns, Stephen's life looked simple on the surface. He went to school, obeyed his mother, played with friends like any other boy. Yet inside, something darker was forming. By the time he was 13, his private pastime came to light. His mother discovered a hidden collection he had carefully assembled: photographs and newspaper clippings of crimes, accounts of brutal killings, stories of infamous figures whose names sent shivers down the spine. Each one had been cut, saved, and glued into an album as if they were pieces of some puzzle only he understood. Ruth was horrified, ready to drag her quiet son to a psychiatrist. Stephen, on the other hand, felt no guilt. To him, it was simply gathering information. It was a curious contrast. A boy who looked perfectly normal to his neighbors, yet in his private world, he studied darkness with the discipline of a scientist. He claimed to be no different from anyone else, yet his imagination lingered on the fragile edge where reality twists into something unsettling. Looking back, it's impossible not to ask, was this the seed of what would come later? Could a child who clipped out tales of horror for fun have grown into anything but a master of fear? The life of a writer often carries a romantic image: a desk by the window, words flowing onto the page like magic. For Stephen King, the reality was far from that. After finishing his degree in English literature at the University of Maine, he found himself working as a schoolteacher, earning just enough to survive. His yearly salary was barely $6,500, not nearly enough to cover the needs of a young family. He and his wife Tabitha lived in a cramped trailer, the kind where every sound traveled from one room to another, where privacy was a luxury, and the walls seemed to press closer with each passing winter. Rent was a constant struggle. Bills piled up, and there were days when even small purchases felt like a risk. To make ends meet, Stephen worked in an industrial laundry, breathing in steam and bleach, his hands raw from the endless handling of sheets. Tabitha stood behind the counter of a Dunkin' Donuts, selling coffee and pastries while raising their children. Yet every night, when the trailer finally grew quiet, Stephen would sit down at a makeshift desk, sometimes nothing more than a corner table balanced between other furniture, and he would write. He typed furiously, clinging to the hope that one story might change their lives. Most of his early attempts were met with rejection. His tales ended up in men's magazines with names like Dude and Swank, earning a few dollars here and there, barely enough to buy groceries. Still, he pressed on, filling page after page in the dim light while exhaustion pulled at his body. Then came the story that almost didn't happen. He began a manuscript about a teenage girl with strange powers, but frustration made him toss the pages into the trash. Tabitha, recognizing something hidden in those discarded lines, rescued them and urged him to continue. That manuscript became Carrie. In 1973, a publisher offered him $200,000 for the rights. The news reached him on a Sunday, and he later remembered wandering through the streets of his small town, barely able to contain his joy. He wanted to surprise Tabitha with a gift, but every store was closed. The only thing he could find was a hairdryer from a pharmacy. The first windfall from that book could have bought anything: jewelry, fine clothes, something extravagant. Instead, Stephen returned home carrying a hairdryer. To outsiders, it might have seemed absurd, but to Tabitha, it was a gift heavy with meaning. It was proof that their days of scraping by were behind them, a symbol of care disguised as something ordinary. King loved catching her off guard with surprises. Once, he returned from the lake at dawn with a base so large it barely fit in his hands. Rather than cleaning it in the kitchen, he slipped it into the bathroom toilet, lowered the lid, and quietly waited in the dining room. When Tabitha, still half asleep, opened that lid, The splash that followed was enough to send her scream echoing through half of Bangor. Neighbors probably thought something dreadful had happened, but for the Kings, it was just another morning. Over the years, Tabitha became more than a wife and partner. She was his muse, the steady presence against his storms, the one who could bring him back from the brink when the world, or his own imagination, became too heavy. Yet even in such a deep bond, there were fractures. At one point, she left him without explanation, only to return just as suddenly, as if nothing had happened. Neither of them has ever spoken publicly about what lay behind that absence. It is a silence that lingers in their story, a reminder that even for the person closest to him, there are doors in Stephen King's life that remain closed. And perhaps that is where his greatest mysteries begin, in the places even love cannot fully unlock. Stephen King has always walked a thin line between the image he presents to the world and the hidden currents that run beneath it. To his readers, he is the king of horror, a master who crafts nightmare after nightmare with ease. In interviews, he often comes across as approachable, even humorous, a man who insists he worries about the same things everyone else does. Yet behind that mask, fear plays a far larger role than most suspect. At one point, King anonymously filled out a questionnaire for a psychological institute conducting a large-scale study. When the results returned, the diagnosis was clear: paranoid tendencies, bordering on schizophrenia. King himself found the label almost amusing, but he did not reject it entirely. His imagination, after all, has always leaned toward suspicion, dread, and the belief that something just out of sight might be watching. He admits to an array of superstitions that would seem eccentric in anyone else: tossing salt over his shoulder, knocking on wood, refusing to walk under ladders. He avoids black cats and black birds, and insists that hotel rooms must never be left in complete darkness. He claims that when someone shivers unexpectedly, it means a goose has just flown over the future site of their grave. Even his computer, he once said, runs on some mysterious power beyond electricity. To friends, these quirks might sound like jokes, but to King, they are survival tactics, small rituals to keep the chaos at bay. Most of all, he is haunted by the thought of mortality, the fragility of life, the suddenness with which it can be taken away. These are themes he cannot escape. When a truck nearly struck his young son years ago, King refused to let the terror fester inside him. Instead, he sat down at his desk and poured the horror into a story that would become Pet Sematary, transforming raw fear into words. This is the strange paradox of Stephen King. The very anxieties that trouble him most deeply are the ones that fuel his art. Each superstition, each dark suspicion, each restless night becomes material for another tale. To his readers, those stories are entertainment. For King, they are something more, a way of facing his demons head-on, one page at a time. In Bangor, Stephen King is not simply a famous neighbor. He is a legend, a figure who seems to belong as much to the realm of folklore as to the quiet streets of the town. His mansion, with its black gates and bat-shaped ornaments, has become the center of countless tales. Step into a local bar, buy a round of whiskey for the regulars, and sooner or later someone will lean in to share a story. The details shift with each telling, but the mood is always the same, a mixture of awe and unease. Some claim the dogs that roam his property are not dogs at all, but creatures more like the beasts that stalk his novels, werewolves bound to their master. Others whisper that every Friday, just past midnight, King slips out of his mansion and walks toward the forest. A few say they dared to follow, but none tell the story without a visible shiver. They swear they saw figures waiting for him among the trees, beings with eyes that glowed yellow, like twin moons cutting through the darkness. And they insist King spoke to them in a language that was sharp, strange, and utterly unlike anything human. Of course, rational minds dismiss these accounts as barroom fantasy, the sort of myths that naturally grow around a man who makes a living out of horror. Yet in Bangor, the line between rumor and reality is thin. The house itself feeds the imagination, standing with its iron gates and eerie ornaments like a stage set for the supernatural. And Stephen King, the quiet man who lives inside, never does much to dispel the whispers. Is it possible that the tales are nothing more than drunken invention? Perhaps. But ask the locals late at night, when the air is still and the forest looms dark at the edge of town, and you may find even the most skeptical among them lowering their voice. Because in Bangor, when it comes to Stephen King, no one is ever entirely sure where the stories end and the truth begins. For every admirer who calls Stephen King a genius, there is another who calls him dangerous. In the eyes of some, he is not a storyteller, but a corrupter. A man who fills young minds with images better left unimagined. Religious groups have branded him a mouthpiece of the devil, an author who smuggles blasphemy into living rooms disguised as entertainment. Letters arrive declaring his books more destructive than drugs, insisting they teach violence, rebellion, and despair. The fiercest storm broke in the late 1970s, when a series of tragic school shootings swept across America. Again and again, journalists noticed eerie similarities between the real events and Rage, one of King's early novels, in which a troubled student brings a gun to class. For critics, the connection was enough to condemn him outright. For King himself, the accusations cut deeply. He admitted regret for ever writing the book, later forcing it out of print, but he also pointed out the absurdity of blaming fiction for reality. It's like punishing the messenger for bringing bad news, he explained. Still, the stigma never fully faded. Even as the controversy cooled, the attacks against him did not. Anonymous letters arrived filled with curses and threats, their venom as creative as it was cruel. Some promised to end his career, others promised far worse. Then one day, the danger stepped out of ink and into his front yard. While King was working in his study, the doorbell rang. Tabitha opened the door to find a young man holding a package, his face pale, his voice hollow. "I've got a bomb," he said flatly, "and I'm going to blow you all to hell." For several long moments, everything hung in silence. The box in his hands looked real, heavy, wired. But when police arrived, they discovered it was fake. A bluff carried out by a failed writer who believed King had stolen the idea for misery from him. The incident ended without harm, but its shadow lingered. For King, it was proof that the boundary between his imagination and the real world was thinner than anyone cared to admit. His stories had always unsettled readers. Now it was clear they could unsettle the unstable too, enough to bring their rage to his very doorstep. Away from the rumors, away from the darkness, Stephen King's world holds other, quieter passions. Chief among them is baseball. Behind his mansion in Bangor, he built his own field, a perfectly groomed diamond said to have cost him nearly $1 million. It isn't just decoration. For King, the crack of a bat and the rhythm of a game are as vital as any story. He watches, he plays, he organizes, as though the sport itself is another form of narrative, one filled with suspense, sudden reversals, and heroes rising in unexpected moments. Another place where King's generosity is carved into the town is the public library. While critics call him the Antichrist or a corrupter of youth, Bangor residents know that their library stands in part because King personally funded its renovation. "I love to read," he explained, when asked why he invested so heavily in something that could never make him money. It was a simple answer, but one that revealed a side of him far from the horror headlines. His reading tastes, however, are as unusual as the man himself. King has devoured the complete works of Dean Koontz and Raymond Chandler, yet admits he has never touched Leo Tolstoy. No amount of persuasion, he insists, could make him believe Tolstoy is more interesting. It's a confession that baffles literary purists, but perfectly fits a writer who has always carved his own path. Then, with the world watching, King once declared he would never again write horror. Some believed he had burned out, that he had given everything he could to the genre. Others whispered that he had ventured too close to the invisible edge he wrote about so often, that thin veil between imagination and something darker, something best left untouched. But few believed he could keep such a vow. Everyone knows that once a writer has unleashed certain demons, they do not simply go back to sleep. And so, even as his announcement echoed across the literary world, readers waited. They knew his imagination was not finished. They knew the promise would break. Because if there is one truth about Stephen King, it is that stories, especially the terrifying ones, are his lifeblood. To stop writing them would be to stop being Stephen King. Every morning in Bangor, while most of the town is still stretching awake, Stephen King is already at his desk. Music hums from his own local radio station, coffee cools beside the keyboard, and the ritual begins. For at least 4 hours a day, words spill out of him. He has kept this rhythm for decades, breaking it only twice a year, once on July 4th and once on his birthday, September 21st. Those are the only 2 days he allows himself to step away from the page. Every other morning, no matter the weather, no matter his mood, he writes. This discipline is almost supernatural in its consistency. Year after year, it has produced a torrent of novels, short stories, screenplays, and essays, enough to fill shelves and still leave room for more. To outsiders, such output seems impossible. To King, it is survival, a way of keeping his restless mind in check. He calls it a job, but it is also a compulsion, a need to turn imagination into form before it overwhelms him. Yet even as the stories keep coming, his body reminds him of its limits. A degenerative eye condition has been slowly stealing his sight. Stronger and stronger glasses no longer restore what is fading. He can barely see straight ahead anymore. Only his peripheral vision remains sharp. Most would consider it tragic. King, however, treats it with the same dark humor that colors his fiction. As a writer, he once joked, I hope to keep that ability as long as I can, to see what's happening out of the corner of my eye, in the dark places. It is a striking image, a man whose very art depends on noticing what others miss, now literally living on the edges of vision. His imagination, so vivid and relentless, has always been both a gift and a burden. Without it, he might have lived a quiet, ordinary life. With it, he has built worlds that have terrified and enthralled millions. But it also ties him to the shadows, making him their captive as much as their master. And so he continues, day after day, pouring fears, dreams, and visions onto the page. Because for Stephen King, stopping is not an option. To write is to breathe. To imagine is to endure. And as long as he can still glimpse the world out of the corner of his eye, the stories will not stop. Stephen King's favorite room in his mansion is not the grand parlor, not the kitchen where Tabitha sometimes still teases him about that bass in the toilet, but his study. It is here that his worlds are born. Worlds of haunted hotels, restless spirits, cursed towns. The desk sits heavy with pages, the air hums faintly with music from his radio, and every corner feels charged, as if the stories themselves are alive, listening for their turn to be written. But the study holds something else, something visitors rarely forget once they discover it. Behind a row of books, one shelf does not sit quite like the others. With a push, it slides aside to reveal a hidden staircase. At any moment, if a guest grows too dull or the conversation drifts, King can vanish behind that secret door. 1 second he is in the room, the next he is gone, swallowed by the walls of his own house. Where the staircase leads, only he knows, and he never explains. It is hard not to see the metaphor. Stephen King has spent his life disappearing behind bookshelves, slipping between the ordinary world and the one built of imagination. To readers, he reemerges holding nightmares shaped into words, as if he has traveled somewhere beyond and returned with souvenirs of fear. Yet even those closest to him cannot always tell which side of the doorway he truly belongs to. Perhaps that is the ultimate mystery of the King of Horror. He has given us characters, monsters, and stories that feel more real than reality itself. But the question lingers, one that neither the townspeople of Bangor nor his millions of readers can answer. Does Stephen King control the stories he writes? Or have the stories, at last, taken control of him?